Okay, this is podcast number 1 for the respiratory system. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about the various organs that make up the respiratory system. So, namely, we'll be talking about the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and then the lungs themselves, which are filled with small air sacs called alveoli. In later podcasts, we'll take a look at how the air actually flows in and out of our entire respiratory system. But each of these structures along the way have specific jobs to do to the air before it actually gets to your lungs and your alveoli. So the respiratory system has 4 main jobs that it needs to perform. The number 1 job that is most important is gas exchange between the blood and the environment. The main gases that need to be exchanged are oxygen and CO2. Oxygen is needed for cellular respiration to occur, and that's how our cells get energy. And during that process, carbon dioxide is produced as a waste. And if carbon dioxide were to build up in your blood, then your blood would become very acidic and it can actually destroy your cells. So we need to be able to exchange, get oxygen into our body and carbon dioxide out, and that's the main function of the respiratory system. The respiratory system also is performing the jobs of purifying and preparing our air before it comes in. Gives us our olfactory sensation so that we can smell things, and also allows us to produce sounds for vocal communication. So let's take a look at the divisions of the respiratory tract. So the conduction portion is basically how the air is getting into the body. So that is just taking air in through the nose and getting it to the lungs. So this is where the air is going to get cleaned and warmed and purified and all that kind of stuff. The respiratory portion is the smaller part of this. So this is where the gas is actually going to eventually become in contact with the blood, in a sense, through the capillaries. So this is the smaller portion of it, but where we're actually going to get the oxygen and the gas exchange to occur is in the respiratory portion. All right, so we're going to start by talking about the upper respiratory tract, which basically is your nose and throat, if you look at it that way. So this is going to include all the different structures that make up your nose, and you can see by looking at this picture there is a ton of different structures within the upper respiratory tract. We are not going to go into this much detail, but we're going to talk about some of the major portions along the way that air is going to travel. So we're going to start at the nose. The nose has several really important structures within it. One is this is where your olfactory receptors are located. They're usually on the superior surface, or the upper part of your nose, and this is going to allow you to detect different smells. Your olfactory receptors are actually closely linked to your taste buds, and so a lot of times smell and taste go hand in hand. There is mucosa all throughout the nasal cavity that is going to moisten the air as it comes in, and also is going to trap dust and bacteria and other things that you might be breathing in on a daily basis. It gets stuck in the mucus inside of your nose. There are the conchae, which are projections in the nasal cavity that basically they're kind of like bone projections that come down, and they are going to help mix up the air. It's air turbulence within the nasal cavity. And that actually helps with the process of purifying it and making sure that the air is getting processed completely before it moves on down to your lungs. Also associated with your nose are your various sinuses, and your sinuses are these cavities that are within your bones. And they help to lighten the skull, and they also help to kind of resonate sound, so it gives sound something to kind of bounce off of. And also your sinuses are used to produce a lot of the mucus that you also are going to need in order to keep the air purified. So sometimes people's sinuses will get infected, where excess mucus will get produced and get stuck in the sinuses, and that can be a sinus infection. Now from your nose, you are going to head down to your pharynx, which is your throat. This is a muscular passageway from the nasal cavity down to the larynx. It is the only place other than your mouth where you're going to have both air and food pass. Inside your throat you have your tonsils. And this is also where your tubes from your ears collect. So sometimes people will get clogged tubes that go to their ears, and you can actually use your nose and throat to kind of clear out those tubes, especially if you're on an airplane or something like that. So in the nose, the air was purified, it was warmed, cleaned and everything, and then it's going to pass briefly through your pharynx, so that's just the back part of your throat. And then it's going to come in contact with your larynx, which is your voice box. Basically, your larynx's main job is actually to make sure that the air is going to go where it's supposed to go and food goes down the esophagus. So it wants to make sure the air is going down the trachea and the food goes down the esophagus. So inside your larynx, you have 8 rigid cartilage rings, and there is elastic flap that covers it, and that flap is called the epiglottis. So basically what the epiglottis does is when you swallow, the epiglottis closes over your larynx, your trachea, your food tube, or your air tube, and keeps food from going down it, and it makes the food go down the esophagus instead. If somebody is laughing or talking at the same time that they're eating, sometimes the epiglottis gets stuck open because as you're speaking, air is getting pushed out, so the epiglottis has to be open. So sometimes that's why people will choke when they're eating and talking at the same time. So within your larynx, you have your vocal cords, and they vibrate as air pushes through them, and that will create sound. So you can control your vocal cords to a degree and make different sounds come out. But the basic voice that we all have has to do with the length of our vocal cords. Men have longer vocal cords, so they tend to have deeper voices. All right, so the trachea is the windpipe, and basically at the top of the windpipe is the larynx, and then the trachea is going to branch down into one of 2 bronchi. Inside your trachea, you have a lot of ciliated mucus. So cilia are little hair-like projections that come off the top of a cell, and these little hairs are going to kind of beat back and forth as the air comes in, and they're going to help to capture any dust that got through your nose and any other debris and keep it away from going to your lungs. So a lot of times if you cough something up and you cough up a little bit of mucus or something, it's usually coming from your trachea, not all the way in your lungs, because you want to get rid of that stuff before it gets to your lungs. So we can get rid of that mucus that's loaded with all that dust and debris and everything and get it away. And again, these are reinforced with all of these rings of cartilage, so your trachea is flexible. It's not rigid bone, but it's also still very strong. All right, from the trachea, the air is going to divide into one of 2 bronchi. One goes to the left lung and one goes to the right lung. The right bronchus is actually wider and shorter than the left. And each bronchi is then going to branch off into smaller and smaller and smaller branches that are called bronchioles. So basically it's like a fork in the road. So the air gets to the end of the trachea and it's going to go to the right, and some of it's going to go to the left. From there, this is where the air can actually get into the lungs. So the lungs themselves occupy most of the space within your thoracic cavity. You've got your heart right in between them, and then the rest of the space in your upper cavity there is your lungs. The apex, which is the bottom part of them, the top part of them, where they kind of come together, the point where they come together, that's near the clavicle, which is your collarbone. And then the base of them rests down by your diaphragm. And then each lung actually has divisions to it. So the left lung has 2 lobes and the right has 3. The left lung is a little bit smaller because the heart takes up some of the space on the left side of the thoracic cavity, so there's not as much room for the left lung over there. Now the lungs are actually covered in pleura, and the visceral pleura is what is going right around the outside. So the pulmonary visceral pleura is right around the outside of the lung, connected to the lung surface. And then you have another lining called the parietal pleura that kind of holds the entire, both lungs together. So it's kind of like a double bag system. We talked about the body cavities being lined before. So the lungs have a layer right next to them, and that's your visceral. So if, like, here's one of your lungs, there's a layer that goes right around it, almost connected to the lungs. And there's your other lung, and it's got its nice little, that's the visceral that goes around it. And then there's a larger bag that kind of goes around both of them. That's the parietal pleura. And that goes around the wall of the entire thoracic cavity. And then there's fluid between them because your lungs are constantly moving, they're expanding and contracting. So there's all sorts of fluid that is in here that helps to reduce friction and lets the lungs move very smoothly. Okay, so this is just a picture of the lungs and how they are associated. So here is your heart in the middle, and you've got major blood vessels. Remember, your pulmonary arteries are going to lead over to your lungs, and the pulmonary veins bring the blood back over to the heart. And there's blood vessels that are just filling up your lungs completely, all within. So here would be the vertebrae in the back, and here's the front. This would be your sternum, and here are your two lungs. So this is just a cross-section that you could look at. Now, your lungs are actually filled up with small branches of the bronchi called bronchioles. And all of them but the very, very smallest actually have cartilage within them. So you can kind of think about a tree. If you have the trunk of a tree, that would be the trachea, and then you've got a couple of major branches that come off that tree. Those are the bronchi. And then off of those major branches, you've got smaller and smaller little branches that come off, and those are the bronchioles. And they are reinforced until you get to the very end. The very smallest of the bronchioles are called terminal bronchioles, and they're going to end with our little air sacs called the alveoli, and those are kind of like the leaves of a tree. So it's a nice analogy that you can do when we're looking at the lungs. So let's take a closer look at the alveoli. The alveoli basically have three main parts. There's a duct. A duct is where the air is going to come in. It's the sac itself, and then you have the entire alveolus. So this is where the gas exchange is going to happen, and that happens through a portion of the alveoli called the respiratory membrane, and this is where we're going to be doing that oxygen exchanging for CO2. So that exchange between those two is going to happen in the alveoli. The respiratory membrane is actually an air-blood barrier, so it makes sure that your blood doesn't get into the alveoli. It's got to be protected. So it's a very thin, like almost thin layer of skin, basically, that lines the inside of the alveolus. And then there's capillaries that cover the complete outside of the alveoli. And basically, each part of these are only 1 cell thick. So air is going to be able to diffuse directly through the alveolar walls and into the capillaries and vice versa. So let's take a closer look at that. So as we go down, again, here's a main bronchus, and then it branches off into smaller bronchioles until you get to your very small bronchioles. Those end at the alveoli, okay? And one of these little circles here is an alveolus. And you can see there's little holes in there. Those are the ducts. That's where the air is going to be coming in and out. Now, each of the alveoli looks like a bundle of grapes in a sense, and they are covered by tiny blood capillaries. So all inside, all around the outside, you have these blood capillaries, and the inside you have that respiratory membrane that is kind of protecting the air from the blood to make sure there's no mixing. But this little part of the alveoli, they're incredibly thin. They're only a cell thick, so they're also very fragile. So for the gas exchange to happen, gases will cross this respiratory membrane by diffusion. So in diffusion, molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So that means when you breathe in, you have more oxygen in the air that you're breathing in, which would be in your lungs. So the oxygen is going to diffuse into your blood via those capillaries that are surrounding them. Then the carbon dioxide, you'll have a higher amount of carbon dioxide in your blood than you do in the alveoli, so the carbon dioxide will diffuse out of the out of the blood into the alveoli, and then you can breathe it out. So this is like the main big important piece of what's happening in your respiratory system, is this exchange of gases. Now we also have to remember that we need to be protected against microorganisms because there are bacteria and viruses all over the place. So every time you breathe in, you're breathing in debris that doesn't get caught along the way. And so there are blood vessels that are around in this area that are going to protect, or macrophages, not blood vessels, macrophages, white blood cells, that are going to protect against infections. And there's also a surfactant coat, and that is actually going to help to keep the alveoli inflated like balloons so that they don't collapse upon themselves. So every time that you breathe out, you don't want your alveoli collapsing completely, so they actually stay partially inflated. Kind of like if you blow a balloon and then let the air out, but just don't let it out completely, you get a little bit left and it stays a little bit inflated the entire time. Okay, so this is just showing the respiratory membrane and all these different parts. So here are some of those cells that are going to make that surfactant that's going to keep the alveoli inflated. Here's a blood vessel that is coming down, so you can see the red blood cells in there. And so this exchange of gases is going to happen between the alveolus and the blood, right? Oxygen is going to go into the blood, carbon dioxide is going to come out. And here you can see these pores, and this is where the air is actually entering to get into the entire alveolus, so that the exchange can happen. So when you breathe in, these get filled up, the air rushes in. When you breathe out, the air is going to rush back out, and that is it. So we'll take a closer look at some of these functionings in the next podcast.